ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to another of our local history programs. It's the first one we've had this fall. We hope to have one every month. My guest this evening is Harvey Jay, a longtime resident of St. Thomas, owner and manager of the Elgin Handles, and for a long time in the financial business in St. Thomas. Harvey, it's very kind of you to be on the program. And,
thank you, George. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to explain first that Mr. Jay comes from Meaford originally, and in the 1870s in Meaford, his grandfather, Charles Jay, another man named William Trout, and the famous American naturalist John Muir were in the handle business and had a factory on the Little Beaver River at Meaford, which was destroyed by fire, and John Muir subsequently went back to the United States and became the famous naturalist he was. He had been a naturalist before. Now, what we want to talk about this evening is the history of Elgin Handles, but we have to do it in a kind of odd way, and I hope you'll bear with us. The first thing we want to do is to talk about George P. Smith and the Lewis family. Now, Harv, could you fill us in about George P. Smith, when he came to St. Thomas, and when Lewis came to St. Thomas?
Well, Mr. Smith came to St. Thomas in 1896. He came with his mother and father, Mr. and Mrs. James Smith, from Crampton, a little community east of Springfield. Mr. James Smith there operated a cheese factory. When they moved to St. Thomas, James Smith began operating a provision factory or a grocery store and butcher shop or meat store. And Mr. George Smith worked with his father in that business. At the same time, he attended St. Thomas Collegiate Institute.
Harv, where was that store? Our viewers won't remember that.
It was on the corner of the southeast corner of Wellington and Ross Street.
And that's still there, that building?
The building is built by Mr. Smith, is still there, yes. Mr. James Smith, I say,
yeah,
built the building.
And now what about the meat business he ran there? Could you tell us something about that?
Well, it became a very progressive business, and eventually he was running, I think it was 6 or 7 horse-drawn rigs and 3 or 4 boys at school. The boys used to get up early in the morning and go out and take the orders for the meat and then deliver the meat after school. Eventually he was able to hire himself a Ford truck, but this still didn't keep up with the demand for the business he had. And in 1918, he eventually changed it over to a cash and carry business. He told me on some occasions on Saturday night when he would go home from the shop to his home that he'd have as much as $1,000 in one day's receipts, which at that time was a lot of money. I'll tell you, he had an enormous business.
Tell us about those delivery wagons he had. He had 6 delivery wagons working for him. And now who looked after the horses?
Well, he told me he used to get up at 5:30 in the morning and go over and feed and look after the horses, and then come back and have breakfast so he could be at the shop at 7 o'clock to begin his daily work, which was a long day.
And then these young boys who worked for him would take the orders in the morning, go to school in the daytime, and after school would hitch up the horse and deliver the orders all through the city.
That's correct. He used to tell me about 2 brothers that he had working for him by the name of Tom Cotlin, who was later superintendent of the New York Central, and his brother Lou. And I talked to Tom at one time, and he said he was very proud of his first paycheck, 25 cents for an afternoon's work. He was very proud of this.
Now, George P. Smith then ran this successful meat business, and he married
Olive Lewis.
Yes. Now, when did the Lewis family come here?
They came here in, I believe it was early in 1900s, quite early, 1901 or 2.
Yeah.
And Mr. Lewis, Joseph Lewis, Mrs. Smith's father, worked with the Jade Still Company, and also her brother, Charles Lewis. Joseph Lewis was a timber buyer, and Charlie Lewis was timber buying too, but done quite a lot of the sawing. So he was kind of felt, they both felt they were equipped to go into the handle business, which eventually happened.
And the J.H. Still Company was a handle business too.
That's right.
And it was at Railway Street.
Well, they were located where the present Memorial Cemetery is now.
No, that's later they were. Their place burned down in '98.
Well,
That's right, after the Lewises came, but before that they'd been on Railway and Wellington Street.
They
and that was
probably were
burned
about
down
where
in 1898. Then they moved out to where the cemetery was. You were telling me something else about running a grocery store. Most people have, because of the shopping plazas we have, forget what it was like when there were just small independent butcher and grocery stores in the city, and the delivery business was a big part of it, wasn't it?
Well, it became so big for him that he refused to deliver beyond Elm Street and beyond the Wabash track. He had to confine his delivery to that area.
And you're also saying, you mentioned he changed to cash business, and you have a sort of story of when you emptied the house.
We found basketfuls of unpaid bills. We had to throw them out, yes.
Yeah.
He was very generous, I guess. A lot of people needed, and maybe some who didn't need the money, too.
That was the big hazard of a merchant, wasn't it?
I guess
the
it must have
independent
been,
business. Well, I think what I'd like to do, Harv, now is show a couple pictures of George P. Smith, who is one of the founders of the Elgin Handles, and this is Joseph Lewis.
That's Joseph Lewis.
Yes.
George P. Smith's father-in-law. Yes.
And these two men and Charlie Smith.
Charlie Lewis,
formed the Elgin Handles when?
In 1913, I believe, was the first that, 1909, so when they first began their business. And they began in a very small building at the north end of what is now Elgin Handles property that then belonged to the Herd Company. The Herd Company had moved here from Amherstburg and Lambeth and built the present plant in 1888, I believe it is, the one building that is still standing.
That's the part of the Elgin Handles, the old yellow brick.
That's right. That's the old brick. That was the original plant. And they also had quite a large warehouse just south of that building, where the red brick building now stands. It is the warehouse that has been used by the company ever since. That building burned in 1933. I remember at the time I was at the theater, and coming out I saw this quite large blaze in the north end of town, and hurried over, and I thought, boy, isn't that a great fire? You know, so many things stored in there, all wooden, of course. There was quite a bit of controversy over the fire at the time, and investigation practically convinced the owners that it had been set in one corner of the building, but it was a very disastrous fire for them at the time.
Well, I'd like to go back just for a minute and talk about the Herd Company, which was originally formed in 1878 in Lambeth, then to Amherstburg, then they came here in '88.
That's right.
And the building they built here is still the central portion of the present Elgin Handles. Now, Smith and Lewis started the handle works, a small one.
Well, Mr. Charlie Lewis and Mr. Joseph Smith Sr. Began the business. They were working, Mr. Smith was providing some of the money for it, and two men were operating the business in this little building at the north end of what is now the Handle Company.
Yeah. Well, then we were looking at some articles of incorporation. That's 1915. They formed a more formal partnership.
That's right. They formed a more formal partnership. And at that time, they bought the Herd Company.
I see. What had the Herd Company hadn't specialized in handles?
No, they didn't make any handles, as far as I know. They used to manufacture spokes for wagon wheels and wagon rims and tongues and whiffletrees and that sort of thing. I don't think they ever manufactured any complete wagons, but parts for wagons. There was a big demand for them, of course, at that time. And they were primarily located here because of the supply of hickory timber and hard maple that was abundant here at that time.
Well, could you explain about that? I don't think, because the Still Company came here, we had Elgin Wooden Wares here, we've had Elgin Handles, and why did all these wooden companies
Well, because at that time there was large supplies of shellbark hickory, or shagbark hickory as some people call it, also two other kinds, mockernut hickory, which is something like pecan, and what we call the bitter hickory, which is quite abundant now. There is still some shellbark hickory, but it's not very good quality. At that time, the quality was very much better.
And there were just two places, I understand, in southeastern Ontario
in
where
southern Ontario and along the South Thousand Islands and the St. Lawrence River. the only place that this shellbark hickory grew in quantity.
And so that would be why Elgin Handles and there was the Wegg Wagon Works were here also. And,
for the same reason, yes.
Charlie Wegg and George Wegg, both, but the location of the hickory trees.
And I suppose the Candlewood Products are here for a similar reason, too.
Yes. Yeah.
That was the old National Woodenware, was a distributing agency for handles and other things, too, along the same washboards and many other things like that.
Yeah. So Elgin Handles, then, was born really in 1915.
That's actually when the incorporated company became an entity, yes.
And I understand Charlie Lou, was it, or the father died?
The father died in 1918. And of interest, too, that Mrs. Smith writes in her diary that they took their car off the blocks for the first time that spring on March the 18th in 1918.
Could you explain that, Harvey?
It would be stored, I suppose, because it wasn't possible to get conveyances around the city or any without snow plows and the convenience we have now.
So they put the car up in blocks for the winter.
I guess that's what it was. Yeah.
And what was the date you took the car off the blocks, put the wheels up?
March the 18th, 1918.
March the 18th,
That was the day that Mr. Lewis passed away.
Mrs. Smith is Mr. Jay's mother-in-law, and she kept a diary of what dates?
She began keeping a diary in 1904. It is not as it's complete enough, but it's a little later on she became more eloquent and more filled out her diary more completely after that time, and up till she about 1974 she became unable to look after I'm sorry, 1970 she became unable to look after the diary herself. So my wife has carried on ever since. So we have a complete diary in the Smith family from 1904 to the present day.
For heaven's sake. But what I find interesting is that she put down in her diary, like when they moved to a house, when the telephone came.
That's right.
What was the first telephone? Here's one. October the 2nd, 1908, mail delivery started in St. Thomas.
House-to-house delivery began then, yeah. Which, that's the sort of thing that she had in her diary.
Well, I think that's makes them invaluable as a research document, you know.
What are we going to do with it when our interests are lost in it?
Well, Harv, I don't know. You should give it to the museum or make sure it's somewhere where it isn't going to be destroyed, because diaries like that are invaluable. You know, the hardest kind of history sometimes to research is the history of this century. You know, you can get the newspapers and go back in the 1870s and 80s, but it's a little harder to fill in a lot of things in the 20th century. Things happen so fast, and you assume the telephone was here forever, you know, and hydroelectricity and everything else.
There was one more thing of interest. Between the 1930s and 50s, there were 4 other handle companies in the area. One in Windsor, one in London, one in Strathroy, and one in Hesper. And these were all located in this area for the same reason. However, the other 4 companies were all subsidiaries of much larger companies, principally American companies. And it's of interest, too, because they were subsidiaries of a larger company. Elgin Handles is the only one that has survived, which to me has got to say a lot for individual...
Well, I think it would indicate pretty good management.
That's right. Well, not only good management, but also for the individual ownership.
Yeah. Now, I think we better explain, Harv, how your name is Jay and how you got into the Smith family. You married...
I married Dallas Smith in 1936.
And you've been a banker.
Married ever since, too.
Yeah. And you were a banker before that.
I was in the Bank of Montreal. I came to St. Thomas in 1932 with the Bank of Montreal, transferred here. And I went to Wallaceburg for about a year and a half, and then came back with Elgin Handles in 1936.
So then you moved into the Smith family business, and you were in that for how long?
I was in that until 1957, when I sold to the present owners, the Day family.
Yeah. And that's Hap Day. I was quite excited when I read about that sale, because I'd always admired Hap Day as a hockey player and a coach. And
many people believe that he should be manufacturing hockey sticks, but he wasn't interested in staying with the hockey business anymore. He wanted to be with something divorced completely from the hockey business. But
that's interesting that people have said he should manufacture hockey sticks, because the J.H. Still Company were the biggest manufacturer of hockey sticks in Canada, I understand.
I believe they were at one time, yes. But the type of equipment they used was very difficult equipment. It required a very heavy steam pressure to bend those blades as they were bent at that time. Of course, they're no longer bent, they're laminated, but at that time they were bent. And after you used the stick for a while, it began to straighten out. And as we were kids, we used to get the discarded hockey sticks from the rink at home and use them, but they were never very much use. They were getting pretty straight by that time. We didn't have pucks either. Do you want me to tell you what we used?
What did you use?
Horse fruit.
Oh, yeah, I see, yeah. Horse manure, right? Yes, that froze to pretty
When
hard
it got frozen, it was
didn't
pretty effective.
Well, let's get back to Elgin Handles in the 1930s. You explained that all the handle companies started here because of supply of hickory. Now, in the 1930s, we had a botanical disaster in Ontario.
Well, that's a good way of describing it, I guess. At that time, there were two sweet sap trees in the area, the sweet chestnut and the shagbark hickory. Many people think that we should be including the maple tree in that, but after the runoff in the spring, the sap turns quite bitter, and consequently it isn't as attractive to birds after the spring runoff. In the early 1930s, the disaster, as you call it, a botanical disaster happened, and it killed off almost all of the sweet chestnut trees. There were a few lingered on for a while, but before that time the birds used to peck the sweet chestnut trees, and when they died off, they went to the shagbark hickory, which was the only other sweet sap tree. If you'll count back in the rings, the annual rings in the present shagbark hickory tree, you'll see this is true, that previous to that time, the timber was really good and clear of any defects. But after the birds began to peck them, it made holes in the timber and made streaks which made them undesirable. We used to use the white wood on the bark wood because it had a better appearance in the center, or brown type wood in the center. And there were many tests carried out at different times to prove that the white bark or white timber was a better quality than the red timber, which was never proven. But it made a much more desirable, much better appearing.
It's like that argument about the white eggs and the brown eggs.
I guess that's right. I still prefer brown eggs myself.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
Yeah.
But I think that's interesting, Harv, that the disappearance of the chestnut, it just disappeared very, very quickly, in the same way that the elm tree disappeared a few years ago. And that's
right.
Another great timber tree. We used to sell that elm to especially European manufacturers for furniture. So because the chestnut disappeared, then the sapsuckers and the woodpeckers and so on attacked the shagbark hickory.
That's right.
And with the holes in it, that meant it wasn't good for...
it used to make a mark and it would run up or down the tree maybe 4 or 5 or 6 inches, and the hole, of course, made it useless for the manufacture of striking tool handles.
Yeah.
However, we used to buy at one time, we used to buy all the hickory, local hickory we could buy, because we were shipping large quantities of handles over to South Africa to use for striking tool handles, axe handles, and we used to manufacture a lot of what they call Kaffir hoe, which was a very heavy grubber type hoe used by the Kaffirs, I expect, in Africa. That's the reason it was called this. We had to use a certain percentage of timber, I believe it was about 50% of Canadian timber, before we get a preferential tariff. Consequently, we were using this, buying what shellbark hickory we could use, because it was a low-grade handle we shipped over there.
Well, where did you buy your hickory when the hickory disappeared in the vast quantities that had been here before?
It's of interest where the present company is buying from the 5th generation of our prime supplier at one time. But that came from Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, in that area. Mr. Smith himself used to go down to that area and buy timber frequently. I have done the same thing myself, but not as much as he did. He used to say he knew the state of Arkansas like the back of his hand. He'd been around it pretty well, and had gone into some areas that were very, very run-down areas, and some of his adventures over missing trains and having to walk long distances in the dark were something that should be repeated sometime.
But the Day family are still buying from your same suppliers down there.
They're one of the suppliers they have now is still one of the old Acton family we used to buy from many years ago.
Yeah. That's
Great.
interesting, yeah. Well, Harv, what else during the war? Now, you had some special problems with shipping during the war.
Well, we had, most of our problems were shipping to South Africa, where it wasn't a matter of losing the material so much as trying to replace it. Labor supply was short, and we had a lot of things happen during the war that was very difficult. Of interest, too, Elgin Handles only applied for and received one subsidy from the federal government. If you recall, probably the time prices were frozen during the Second World War, they were completely frozen, and you wouldn't dare sell any article unless you had permission to increase the price. So our opposition were drawing as high as 40% subsidies, and we only drew the one subsidy of 2%, which I think spoke well for management. However, we weren't getting the production we should, and we just simply couldn't, because we couldn't find the labor and we couldn't find the material. It became very, very difficult. But after the war was over, we were the first plant in the city of St. Thomas to be operating with 60-cycle power. The Ontario Hydro Commission authorized us to deal with a local company, and we dealt with Wilson Somerville, and they approved a budget to change our plant, and at the same time the vocational school and the Green Furniture Company. The Green Furniture Company had elevator that they needed 60-cycle power for. So they put transformers on Elgin Handle property, and we operated then with the first 60-cycle power in the area. But of interest, at that time we were powered by one 40-horsepower motor, which drove a line shaft, and it drove all the machines in the company. When we changed over to 60-cycle, we changed over all the motors, and then were changed, and each of the machines were individually driven, which made them much more efficient. And of course, with the old line shaft, we used to run into hot bearings, and we were afraid that we used to have to guard those long after we'd shut down. Somebody would stay on hand to see that they were cooled and that the plant didn't burn down. And of course, when the hot bearings came, we had to shut down the whole place till they got cooled down. It was a very difficult thing to operate a line shaft that was 60 feet long. And,
you have a story about, perhaps you should explain for our viewing audience, that the line shaft ran above near the ceiling.
That's right.
And then all the pulleys, there'd be wheels on that, and the pulleys were attached, or the belts were attached to the wheels, or the pulleys, and down to the wheels to drive a machine. Now, you had an accident there. Was it in the rebuilding?
Well, there were two things that were of interest. When we were making this changeover to the smaller motors, we were moving our pulleys up a little closer than we should have. We were normally had to have twice the width of the pulley between the next pulley and the pulley being driven. And we were sneaking them in a little closer, you know, than we should have. Anyway, this one day I was up on a ladder putting this big belt on. It was about, well, I suppose maybe 10 inches wide and 40 feet long. And it slipped off and went in between the other pulley, and it broke. And here was this 40 feet of belt flying around the factory, and the fellow holding the ladder down below, it hit him in the face and knocked him down. He wasn't hurt badly, but when he came to, all he could see was dust, and he was saying, "I'm killed, I'm killed."
Well, now the other story was...
when we were changing the plant over, we were putting in a concrete floor, and down below the floor there was a lot of sawdust and old logs and so on, and so we were trying to dig all this out. And the plant was sitting, the center part of the plant was sitting on a brick piling and on a wooden upright piece of timber. And all of a sudden the brick piling gave away when the plant was operating, and the whole plant came down that line shaft. And of course it ground to a halt in a very quick time. But of interest, the whole weight of that plant rested on that shaft till we could get it relieved. It was a pretty precarious time for a lot of us.
Snap, or the roof and everything.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I would like to ask you a question about the handle business. You buy all your timber, and you bought locally to start with, and you were telling me one time about a man who you went to see his trees, nobody could buy them, and he had names for all the trees.
We had a contract with the federal government to supply 22 and 24-foot pike pole handles. And these handles had to be very straight grained. The white ash timber, the white ash tree, grows in the forest, and it always grows a little taller than the rest of the trees around it. So when I was out buying timber, I was always looking for these tall tops in the timber. And I came across a place up near Petrolia, and here were a lot of these beautiful trees. So I parked the car and walked across the field into the woods, and here were these magnificent trees, just exactly what we were looking for. Our contract ran between 6 and 8 dozen of these handles, and it was a very, very difficult thing to come by timber that was straight enough and long enough to do the job. We had to do a special adjustment in the sawmill to saw a 24-foot timber.
24 foot?
24 foot long. That's a long piece of timber. So after I'd seen these magnificent trees, I couldn't wait till I could try and buy them, so I began looking for some place to buy them, somebody to buy them from, and I came across a little shack and knocked on the door, and this old chap, pretty grubby-looking old fellow, came to the door, and I told him what I wanted, and he said, oh, he wasn't interested in selling the trees. And I said, why? Well, he said, they've been with the family for so long, I've had this piece of land for so long, and I wouldn't be interested in selling. Well, I said, let's go back and have a look at the timber. Will you come with me? So he went back into the trees, and he would go up and pat them, and he called them by a girl's name. I remember one was Maggie and Margaret. That is after your wife, I guess, was it? But I talked to him for quite a long time, and I said, you know, he said, what are you going to use them for? And I said, we have this contract to manufacture these long handles, and they're going to go to Mr. Mackenzie King's government. That was the thing that said it. He was a staunch liberal, and eventually he agreed to sell them at a fixed price, but he was going to have to cut them down himself. Well, we couldn't permit this because when a hickory or when any piece of timber like that, or ash timber particularly, when it's full of frost, it splits quite easily. So we said, we'll send in our own crew to cut them down, and you will supervise it, which he agreed to. And we had enough timber there to last us for almost 3 years out of that one good purchase of white ash timber. Worthwhile.
Well, Mackenzie King would be glad to know that his
There's no doubt about that.
Bought the trees for you. And you had another famous timber buyer.
We sure did. A very wonderful person, very lovable person.
Now, what was his name?
Name was Clayton Palmer.
Yeah.
His son, Danny Palmer, used to live out at Talbotville. I believe he died a little while ago. But Mr. Palmer was an unusual person. He bought, when he used to buy maple timber for us, particularly, and he bought that with a shovel. He would, if he found a piece of soil that had clay over sand or gravel, this was the perfect type of maple timber that he could buy. We needed to have as clear as possible without defects or streaks to make better. We used to manufacture cantock handles. That was for what had a big bill on the end of it for rolling logs. And one thing about Mr. Palmer that used to disturb me a great deal was that he would never believe in having his money in a bank. And he always carried large quantities of money with him. And he tells a story on himself about being down in the Blenheim area, and he was a jack of all trades. He could turn his hand to almost anything. So he had a provincial government contract to dig a big ditch down there. After they'd finished the contract, he'd paid off the men, and the fellow said, oh, come on, let's throw our overalls. The day is over, let's throw our overalls in the fire. And he told me he threw $4,000 in the fire. And in that time, that was a lot of money. Yeah.
Well, you were telling me another story about Clayton Palmer, that when he was a young boy, he went to work for a sawyer.
He went to work for the J.H. Steel Company. It was his first job as a teenage boy. Yeah. And he was taken out into the woods with the fellows who were cutting the timber. And he said, they told him, now, whatever you do, don't leave the team of horses. So they went off to cut their timber, and, of course, they had to drag the logs out with the horses eventually. And while he was standing there, this tornado came through the woods. We think this place is free of tornadoes, but at that time, apparently, it wasn't. And the timber came down all around him. So it blocked the horses and he in this one spot. And eventually, they had to come and get him and cut him out with cross-cut saws and cut the team out of the woods.
Well, you have to hand it to him. He did what he was told.
He did exactly what he
didn't
was
leave the
told.
horses.
That's
He didn't
right.
run away, eh?
Well, one more thing of interest that about Mr. Palmer and his ability to buy timber. You remember a few years ago there was a tornado went through Sarnia.
Yeah.
Mr. Palmer had gone out on a Friday afternoon and bought quite a large stand of timber near Strathroy, which he was very elated at having bought this timber. By the way, he used to, out of his pocket, he'd take and pay $100 on a piece of timber here and $100 there. I never knew how he ever found out where all the timber was. I don't suppose that his family ever knew where he'd paid all that money on. Anyway, he bought this timber in Strathroy, and in that tornado it blew down. So of course he'd lost his deposit. He didn't lose anything, of course, as far as the timber was concerned, but he wanted to see if he couldn't regain some of the money he'd lost, so he asked us if we would cut some of those fallen logs up. So we brought 2 or 3 logs that would be about 20 or 24 inches in diameter into the plant. We put them through the sawmill, and believe it or not, that tornado had twisted that timber so that it pulled apart and went like toothpicks. When we pulled that, you can't believe that a force can be so mammoth as to twist hard maple timber like that. Hard to believe.
So any tree that's blown down in a tornado is just useless.
Apparently it is, yes. That was the case here anyway. I wouldn't have believed it unless I'd seen it myself. But there are a few people around that could believe it. But one more thing, too, of interest. We used to buy maple timber from all over the area, and occasionally we get curly maple. And the boys in the plant were always interested in having to take it home as soon as they get it dried to make lampstands. And really it was magnificent timber. It was never any use for handles, but it was certainly very useful for making furniture and making lampstands and that sort of thing.
Well, let's go back to the history of Elgin Handles, which starts in 1915. How many sort of additions did you put to the plant? The herd plant was there to begin with, and you started the north end of that. Now, what building went on from 1915 up to the time the Days took over, and they've done some building since, haven't they?
That's right. They've modernized the system for dust collecting and so on. In 1933, the warehouse that stood at the south end of the herd plant burned. And as I said before, it was quite a fantastic fire. It had a metal roof on the building and wooden sides, so it contained the fire in the building pretty well until all of a sudden it let go. And it was quite a... Then the present brick warehouse was built in 1934. In 1945 and 46, all our manufacturing was done on the top floor. So we changed that and did our manufacturing on the ground floor on a concrete floor. We put in a hydraulic elevator, which is one of the only hydraulic elevators in the area. The Public Utilities Commission here guaranteed us 30 pounds pressure. So we were able to lift some pretty heavy loads in this building. You want to look at this picture?
Yes, I have a picture here of the, what date roughly is that?
That's about 1946.
Yeah. Now, could you point out a few people there that...
Well, this is Percy Baker. Percy, well, if he's looking, he'll certainly recognize himself. Sharon McCormick, Colin West, Bob Thomas, who was W.R. Cavanaugh's father-in-law, and Jack Dunn, whose sister was bookkeeper with the plant. She went with Mr. Smith in 1913 and stayed with him till he was out of the business and stayed on with Elgin Handles later on. I think there's only one employee left with the company, and that's Stuart Blakely here in the center. I think the rest of the fellows are just...
which is the one that in that movie, Seven Brides, was taken down to New York?
This is a chap by the name of House in this picture right here. There were 7 brothers, as you recall, that were unmarried, and they were taken down to
I see,
New York
because
City.
of the movie title.
That's right.
Yeah, these 7 House brothers.
That's right.
And they were taken down to New York.
And fitted with Powers models and Rolls Royces and Cadillacs and everything else, I guess.
What year was that, roughly? What time was that? I remember the title of that, 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. But
I can't tell you the exact date. It must have been around 1946 or 47.
Right after the war.
About that, yeah.
Is anyone else there that...
Well, most of these, several of these fellows have passed away, of course. Dick Hartzell here in the center is now up in Valley View and runs the the woodworking shop up there. Dick's son does some very, very fine work with this, manufacturing dollhouses and that sort of thing. He does a very fine job.
And Sharon McCormick, that you pointed out,
he was custodian for the schools
from the Board
here
of Education.
That's
yes,
right.
He was our general.
A mighty fine superintendent.
Yeah.
Colin West, I think he lives out on Elgin Street. But most of the rest of them, I think, are. I can't. This chap here in the corner, he and the chap here were timber buyers for us and used to truck in timber all the time. I think that's about all there would be of interest. Most of the rest of them have passed away.
Yeah. Well, it's a company with quite a long history. We perhaps should show one more picture. This again is a picture with George P. Smith in that corner and Harvey Jay
and my son Lauren here.
Sonny Laurie Jay. Yeah. Well, Harvey, I always think it's a remarkable coincidence that you come from a family that was in the wood business in the 1870s, and you come to St. Thomas and you end up in the wood business in St. Thomas.
It is rather a coincidence. Yeah. Now, they were manufacturing wooden tooth rakes and broom handles.
Yeah.
Of course, wooden tooth rakes are something that are gone by the board now.
Yes.
But
well, if you had a few dozen of those, you could sell them for antiques. What was the biggest order you ever had at Elgin Handles?
I think the biggest shipment we ever made was to Canadian War and Pink. They manufactured pike poles and cant hooks and peavey handles, and we had a large, I remember taking a picture of it. I don't think the picture's available now, but it was a big truckload anyway. It seemed like a lot to us at the time. Our orders never came in large quantities. They were continuing supplying of wholesales primarily. There was one more thing that I've talked to you about before, and I thought was kind of interesting. Just after the war, when labor was very difficult and timber was very difficult, we had been manufacturing what we called a Saguenay pattern, a French handle suitable for Frenchmen. Generally, in the woods, when they're cutting timber, we're cutting with heavy gloves and maybe 2 or 3 pair of gloves. So they had a very small handle, and it was only about 28 to 30 inches long. And we wanted to discontinue this line because we couldn't continue to supply the demand for it because of the lack of timber and labor. So we had about 30 dozen of these handles left, and I had a customer up in a little place called Valgagne, up in it's between Porquis Junction, or between Cochrane and Timmins and Kirkland Lake. I left Timmins one afternoon on the 1 o'clock train, which was a limited train. I'd forgotten the name of it, unless it was the Northland Express. It didn't stop between Timmins and Porquis Junction, and the next stop was Swastika for Kirkland Lake, and the next stop into North Bay, and you'd be in Toronto in the morning. I got talking to I was very anxious to stop at Valgagne because the man I was talking to, Henry Auger, couldn't speak any English, and I couldn't speak very much French. Our communication was very limited. He couldn't write me a letter in English, so I had no way of knowing if he would take the 30 dozen handles. So I was very anxious to stop at Valgagne if I possibly could. So I talked to the conductor for quite a long time, and we became quite friendly, and I said, if you will stop the train at Valgagne, I'll see if I can get you some honey. I heard they'd had honey in Valgagne. It was kind of a story, but it worked. Anyway, he pulled the cord and the train stopped at Valgagne. I raced across the snowdrifts over to the store. I said to Henry, will you take the 30 dozen handles? He said, I sure will. Have you got any honey? He said, I was sold out this morning. So a disappointed conductor, but we sold the timber anyway, or sold the handles.
Well, you sold all over Canada, did you?
From coast to coast, yes. We didn't begin selling in Newfoundland until after Confederation. In 1950 we began selling out there, but we sold thousands of dozens of handles to Bowater's Pulp and Paper Company out there.
Yeah. What about Adam Beck and the Welland Canal? Was that not a pretty big order? You remember that?
Well, it was a continuing order, that's right. Mr. Smith and Adam Beck seemed to have developed a friendship at that time, and he was able to supply them with the handles that were required to take the logs and move them around the canals and so on. And then we had large orders there for That was before my time in the company.
Yeah.
There was one more story you might be interested in. That was kind of fun. I was in Fredericton in New Brunswick one day, and I was going up to Edmundston, wanted to go to Edmundston. It was quite a long trip, but one day up and a day there and a day back, so it was like putting in 3 days to go and make one call. And the Fraser Lumber Companies were a pretty big company, and I was anxious. We'd had some correspondence, and I was anxious to make the contact. And I was to go and see a buyer by the name of Atkinson. And sitting in the Queen's Hotel in Fredericton, it came to me that the man across the lobby from me, I may have heard his name, I can't recall, his name was Atkinson, the man I wanted to see up at Edmundston, 294 or 5 miles away. And I became so excited about the thing, I had to go and ask him, so I went over and asked him if his name was Atkinson, and he said yes. I said, asked him if I could have a few minutes of his time, and he said sure, and we made arrangements that we would be selling them handles. But he said, you know, there are the timber buyers and the foresters of all the area are here down in Fredericton today to attend a convention. And I said, would it be possible for me to show my samples to the convention? He said, sure. He said, I'm having a little cocktail party up in my room. And he said, come on up after 5 o'clock and you can lay out your handles on the bed and tell them what you know about the handle business. So I began thinking, well, I don't know the first thing about the handle, about the hickory that I'm trying to sell. So I went up to the university and to the library, and the girl up there was very cooperative. She gave me several books, and I began making notes and sheets of foolscap notes about all the different kinds of hickory and where they were growing, what they were good for, and so on. I went down and had dinner with Mr. Atkinson at this, Dr. McDonald, I believe his name was the speaker. And on the way out, a chap came to me and he said, Mr. Jay, and I said yes. He said, I have listened with interest what you had to say about hickory today. And he said, you know what you're talking about. I just learned it in the afternoon now. He said, my name is Barney Flager, and he said, I'm professor of forestry. I want you to take 4 one-hour periods tomorrow morning and tell my students about hickory. It doesn't make any difference. If you can fuss a little bit, you can go a long piece, can't you?
Well, of course, Harvey, you did know a lot about hickory, eh? I mean,
I didn't know very much about what I was like to tell the people I was talking to, you know.
This must be, you know, the old wives' tale that the yellow wood or the darker wood isn't as good as the white wood. They've never been able to prove that, eh?
No, I don't. And there was another thing, too, that buyers were very reluctant to buy a piece of timber that was partly white, red and partly white.
Yeah.
They believe it would spittle on that line, but of course this wasn't true either. I think that the older timber, that really the heart into the very heart of the tree was not quite as strong. But another thing too of interest, after we had the collecting system established at the plant, we were contacted by a firm in Dubuque, Iowa, and we used to ship about a carload of hickory sawdust a month to Dubuque, Iowa for smoking hams. They had a contract with the federal government to supply the Army with large quantities of ham, and the hickory smoke made a much better color than the regular sawdust that they would get otherwise.
Did you use the sawdust to supply the steam power?
That's
for your
right,
plant?
we did. We never supplied the steam. Originally, the plant was a steam plant, and I believe it was fired by the sawdust, but it became impractical.
Yeah.
It required shoveling and restoring, and we used to have, eventually we had to have it trucked away, and we used to have a dust collection system that congealed the dust into water, and eventually it had to be shoveled out too. It was a very laborious system, so we were lucky and glad when the day came that we could have all this collected into one area and then shipped.
I've forgotten what I wanted to ask you. There's something that just crossed my mind there, and I wanted to make sure I asked you about.
We were talking about the financial aspect of the business, and it's to me, a very interesting thing that I went with the firm in 1936 and sold it in 1957. 21 years. And in all that 21 years, outside of a few debts that people owed us, we used to ship wood to people who were in need and this sort of thing, which we never expected to collect the money from anyway. We only had one bad debt, $135, and that was my own stupid fault. I should never have sold this stuff, the material I did.
I understand when Hap Day was buying the plant from you that he had a hard time believing that.
That's right. And
that's
I think
all the bad debts there were on the
many
books.
other people had the same feeling too.
Yeah.
However, I think it was very commendable that we didn't do anything worse than that. We could have at times run into a very big problem.
Harv, we have a few minutes left. I think I'd like to go back. I think we've followed the career of Elgin Handles that's flourishing now under the tutelage of the Days. And I'll go back to George P. Smith and his wife, who lived at, what was the number in Wellington?
145.
145, and built that house. They were great adherents of the church there, eh? And always...
Of Central United
Yes.
Church, that's right. Mr. Smith's father turned the sod of the present building. Mr. Smith and Mr. George Disborough turned the sod for the present hall, church hall, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith gave the chimes for the church. So they were a very integral part of the church, even way back in the old evangelistic days, which was Cause de Hunter, where that was their home church.
Now, besides that, when we were when he was running the butcher store on the southeast corner of Ross and Wellington, and then after he formed the Elgin Handles, what happened to the butcher business?
Well, a chap by the name of Jack Dernan bought the business from him. Jack worked for Mr. Smith, and a chap by the name of Spry and Mr. Dernan went into business together. And they operated a successful business there for quite a long time afterward. I can't tell you how long that...
well, no, I can remember Dernan's
I'm sure you could, too.
There, yeah. You haven't any idea who built that building? I know Lewis built it, but
James
who the
Smith.
architect was that a Neil Darrow building? Every time I look at it, I think perhaps Neil Darrow built it. I don't know.
Well, it could be. Now, I can't tell you about that. But Mr. James Smith built the building.
Yeah, 19...
I would say around 1903 or 5, somewhere in there, yes.
It's a nice building. It looks very nice.
It's of interest, too, that Mr. Smith went into business with Frank Merlatt Sr. in the coal and wood business at the corner of Princess Avenue now and Wellington Street. And later on, the Merlatt business was purchased by, or when Mr. Smith died, Mr. Frank Merlatt took over the business, and then Mr. Frank Merlatt Jr., and then Mr. Harvey Pettit bought it from him, and then eventually the McDonald interests that have it now.
Yeah, but still called Merlatt.
Still called Merlatt.
And still in the same
It used to be
location.
Smith and Merlatt at one time, though.
Smith and Merlatt, yeah. Now, another thing, you've always been a very prominent Kiwanian and strong supporter of the club. And what was the year you became governor or district governor?
I was district governor for all of Eastern Canada and the Caribbean in 1967.
Yeah.
A wonderful year, a centennial year. It was a great year to be in that capacity.
And you still keep up your club affiliation?
Yes, I've now belonged to what they call the Seniors Club, which is all retirees in London, a fantastic Kiwanis group.
One other thing I wanted to ask you was about wooden handles for the Arctic.
Well, most of the time was, most of the tests were made during the war when they were trying to get some type of handle that would stand up under extreme cold. Tests were made, many tests were made on hickory, but it was never successful. They even coated hickory with plastic trying to make it usable, but it would crack very easily and splinter pretty badly, so there was never any really successful attempt made to use hickory or wooden handles in the Arctic country. I think eventually the only handle they had up there was something made out of plastic. It was a very porous type of plastic, and not a very good plastic. And the plastic became very cold. Your hands would almost freeze to plastic when they wouldn't freeze to wood. That's what's happened to the pike pole business. We used to manufacture hundreds of dozens of pike poles, and we'd get the timber to manufacture them. But they have been replaced pretty well by aluminum type handles now. But the aluminum too, like the plastic, it gets pretty cold.
Yeah. Well, that brings up a point I hadn't considered: the competition of plastics with wood, which has, you know, come into the furniture business. I suppose this table is a plastic material. How about the competition from plastics for wooden handles? Are they
In
suffering
the longer
from that?
wooden handles, it has never become a factor.
Okay.
In short handles, of course, yes, it has. File handles and this sort of thing, it has become. And one time Mr. Smith used to be quite proud to give each of his daughter's friends who are married, he'd give them a wooden rolling pin. Of course, the wooden rolling pin's gone by the board, too.
Yeah.
They were manufactured out of first-class maple.
Well, did you make?
Only hand-turned, that's all.
Yeah.
One of the fellows at the plant was pretty efficient at that, and he used to turn them by hand.
Well, you know, this is a small company that is still a family business under the days today.
It'd be of interest to know at the time the deal was being made for the days to purchase the company, there were 4 of us involved, beside other people, and there was Mr. C.H.D. himself, myself, C.H.J., and a chap by the name of Bill Kay and Arthur Gray. And there was never any confusion. It seemed to go off very, very well.
I'm afraid we've run out of. Oh, you want to? Well, I want one picture here of. This is a picture of the present plant. It's 3 or 4 pictures on a page, and.
This is the old herd plant here. This is the original building, and this is the brick building that we built after we placed the one that burned by the fire. But you can see there's enormous quantities of lumber required, and it's all sawn to dimension sizes. There were several more things we could have brought up, and perhaps another time we'll talk about them. But this looks to be ash timber here that's being pulled up into the yard. And again, this is the back end of the plant with the sawmill, the present sawmill there.
Well, I might just say that anybody wants to walk around the Elgin Handles today, the white or yellowish colored brick is the part of the old herd plant that was built in 1888.
That's right.
And the days have made several things around. You don't see too much of that white brick anymore.
No, it's pretty well covered up with, I believe, a pollution system that they have endeavored to install. In fact, I guess it's very, very good from what I've heard. But, there are several stories that could be told about it. We'll get a chance to tell again if we have time.
Tell me the one about the man who complained about the dust.
I was afraid you were going to ask about that.
Told him to get a gas mask.
Yeah. Before we did this changeover, this chap came one day and he said, I can't stand the dust in the place. I can't stand dust. Well, I said, go uptown then and buy yourself some kind of a respirator and I'll pay for it. So he come back and lo and behold, he had an old World War I gas mask with a long nozzle on the front of it. This fellow came from a family who wasn't, they really weren't very clean people, and so one of the chaps said, I want to go uptown at coffee break time, and I said, of course, you know that's against the rules. Well, at noon he went uptown anyway, when he bought some Limburger cheese, and he put it in that little nozzle in front of his nose, and it stayed there all afternoon. He didn't even know it was there.
Well, you know, if he's like me, I like Limburger cheese. I don't think
not that close, not close to your nose. I don't think so. You'd like to be able to walk away from it afterward, don't you?
No. What are the most skilled trades in a the man who buys timber? He's a crucial person, isn't he?
That's right too.
Start with.
Yeah, that's right.
What are the next most important men who work in?
I think the lathe operators are pretty. Setting up the lathe is the important thing, and handles anymore are turned pretty rapidly. It's a noisy business. There's a lot of chatter as the piece of timber goes around, but the model is set on the end and it's just turned around and the handle comes out of it. The axe handle has to follow a terrain, but the pick handles and sledge handles and so on are quite round. Another type of handle that the fork and hoe handles go through a lathe from the end, and it comes out the other end all shaped with two sets of knives on it that operate in conjunction with each other. It really isn't a highly skilled business except for the setup business.
Yeah.
Once the lathe is set up, it can be pretty well handled by most anybody that is patient with it and careful, because accidents in that thing can happen pretty quickly, and when they do, they're...
Well, do they still, do the days now, still able to buy all the timber they need in this area, or do they...
They don't buy the timber they need in this area very much anymore. I think they bring most of the timber they require from down the south.
Yeah.
I think they've given up pretty well the use of maple. They use quite a bit of ash yet to manufacture fork and hoe and rake handles, but most hickory, I believe, comes from down south. I don't believe they do any of the buying locally at all anymore, or at least for the hickory buying locally.
Well, of course, we don't have many wood lots anymore that have a lot of trees in them, do we? They're
No,
not,
that's true. And people aren't as careful of woodlots as they used to be. I think that the provincial government subsidize some of the woodlots and give them tax concessions, but they're not as careful as they used to be. Another thing of interest, too, that once a woodlot is pastured, it's never of any use for timber like we would require. Apparently the cattle and so on trample on the roots, and it creates disfiguring in the bark or in the timber. That
I mean, you have a big maple tree, say about that big, and you let cattle walk around?
Walk around, they destroy the root structure, and you see generally the top of the tree is dead.
Yeah.
Right on the very crown of the tree, it's quite dead. This indicates that it's been pastured, which was of no use to us in that time at all.
I suppose, you know, Ontario, this part of Ontario was covered with that gigantic forest of ash and elm and hickory and
I suppose
maple.
it was at one time.
Yes, it was all the way from here to Montreal, really.
It's amazing to see the number of truckloads of logs that are carted along the streets here yet. It must be there must be still quite a bit in the area, and still.
Yes, you still see some.
Generally, you see down in the New York Central Yard too, are quite a lot of walnut logs that are
Yes,
still accumulated there,
Yeah, we still have some big walnut trees around.
but not too many.
No.
That's why we had to be very careful, never to buy a tree that was locally grown in the city. It might have a nail in it. Of course, that would ruin your saw in no time, and that meant shut down for quite a long time.
Yeah, which is too bad because St. Thomas does have some really big trees.
Oh,
you know,
yes,
on
they
the-
sure do. But
The PUC would like to get rid of them.
most of those are soft maples,
Yes,
you know, and they're
yeah.
not much use for.
Well, Harv, I think we're going to have to close this off. I'm sorry we don't have any more time. I'd like to thank you very much for all the work you've done and background you've created for this. And I'd like to tell the people who are watching that this program will be taped tonight, and it'll be repeated tomorrow afternoon, I believe at 2 o'clock, and it'll be repeated again on Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. And next month in November, on the second Wednesday, I don't know what date that is, I'm going to have Forbes Raven as my guest, and we're going to talk about the Raven shoe business that goes back to 1879, and a man named Mr. Wooster, who started the shoe business in a boxcar just across from the studio where we're sitting tonight. And the Wooster building is still on Talbot Street on the north side, and Ravens has been in that location ever since they came into the business, and the shoe business has been there since 1879, which makes it nearly 100 years old. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you on the second Wednesday in November. Good night.